All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome back to VCC 390, Tibetan Buddhist Art and Visual Culture. I am so excited because today we have a special guest speaker here in our class. This is one of the gifts of the pandemic that we can speak to anyone from anywhere. So we have Dr. Karl Debreczeny here. Karl is the senior curator at the Rubin Museum of Art. His research focuses on artistic, religious, and political exchanges between the Tibetan and Chinese traditions. And he has many publications because the Rubin Museum and Karl at the Rubin Museum have been quite prolific in the last, 15 years, 20 years? So, yeah.
I've been there 15, yeah.
15,
Museum
yeah.
2006 open. Anyway, go on.
Right. And for those of you who don't know, even though we've actually mentioned it quite a few times, when and if you can travel again, the Rubin Museum is in New York City, in Chelsea, right? Is that the neighborhood? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
17th Street.
It's a fantastic place, and when you get to New York next, you must all go because you will now have some of the language for the incredible objects that are displayed there. But the Rubin basically is the only museum of Tibetan art outside of Asia or outside of.
No, I mean actually there's one in Staten Island.
Oh right,
there's the Jacques Marchais.
Jacques Marchais, but it's pretty different than the Jacques Marchais.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
How should we say it's small?
Right. But yeah, the Rubin Museum is a new museum-ish, right? 2006 on, but and has been publishing a lot and creating a lot of exhibits and catalogs and a lot of research, sustaining a lot of research also on the history of Tibetan art, which is of course the concern of this class. And this class we are actually organizing around one of your publications. So students, you already know Karl's name because you've read his chapter and several other chapters from Faith and Empire, Art and Politics in Tibetan Buddhism. So we are not reading all of it because we couldn't actually fit it all in to the course, but because this is a condensed summer course kind of style thing, but we're reading it and loving it. So I'm so excited that we have Karl here to speak with us today. So hi, Karl.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to talk, and thanks to the University of Ontario and the Host Center for Buddhist Studies for this invitation. And I'm so happy that someone's actually using this book in the way it's intended, because originally we were going to have this exhibition together with the Berkeley Art Museum, and so we actually designed the book to teach in this way. Then that fell through, but I did get the chance to use this book to teach a class at Columbia. Some chapters more successful than others, so I'll be interested to hear your feedback when it's over. But anyway, why don't I launch into my talk? It's about 40 minutes long, and I'll share my screen if I am allowed to do.
Yes, I've made you co-host, so you should be able to share. Great.
Okay, is that working?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So, Tibetan Buddhism's dynamic political role in the courts of Asia was a major catalyst in moving it beyond Tibet's borders to its neighbors. Tibetan Buddhism was especially attractive to conquest dynasties, like the Mongol Empire, as it offered both a legitimating model of universal sacral kingship, that is, a religious mandate to rule, that transcended ethnic and clan divisions which could unite the disparate people, and also promised esoteric means to physical power, that is, ritual magic, which could be harnessed to expand empires. By the 12th century, Tibetan masters became renowned across northern Asia as bestowers of this anointed rule and occult power. Images were one of the primary means of political propagation, integral to magical tantric rites and embodiments of its power. Rulers, such as Kublai Khan, embraced this path and set a model of rulership that would endure into the 20th century. Even after the collapse of the Mongol Empire in around 1368, and the Chinese reclaimed their land, establishing the native Ming dynasty, the Chinese court continued to follow Mongol precedents for an imperial Buddhist vocabulary symbolic of divine rule. In the 13th and 14th centuries, most of Eurasia had come under Mongol rule, and during the early Ming, the Chinggisid world continued to span much of the continent, perhaps most famously represented by Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who founded the Timurid Empire, who died in 1406. So that's here. So here you can just see the Mongols sort of all around the Ming. This political legitimacy was not only a domestic issue, but concerned multiple audiences. By this time, Kublai Khan's model of rulership was recognized across Asia, and thus the early Ming rulers were speaking in the accepted political language of power in declaring their authority. And North China, by the way, had not actually been under Chinese rule since the fall of the Northern Song in 1127, right? So 250 years. This has not been the traditional understanding of the Ming, which is typically described as having expended a great deal of energy to reassert an ethnic Chinese identity in the wake of Mongol rule. Tibetan Buddhism continued as a faith of the powerful within the inner court. Thus, a great deal of Tibetan Buddhist art was created in the Ming imperial workshops, both for internal court use and as diplomatic gifts, a projection of what today we might call soft power. A continuation of this Tibetanized visual language of sacral rule. Is there a way I can? I think we're blocking some of the images there. A continuation of Tibetanized visual language of sacral rule can be found in this gold object here on the right, found among the gold work excavated from the Prince of Liang's tomb. As you might recognize, right, so this is Yongla's grandson. As you might recognize, this form of Mahakala was a centerpiece of Mongol imperial Buddhism and the most potent symbol of Tibetan esoteric power in the Yuan pantheon. And you might recognize here on the left, a sculpture of the in the Musée Guimet here, dated 1292, with an inscription naming Kublai Khan and his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa as a comparison. While the Chinese goldsmith did not understand the form perfectly, he can be recognized by the bar-shaped gong or gandhi here, balanced across his arms. If this is indeed a hat ornament, as identified in the excavation report, it is a remarkable political statement that a Ming imperial prince would prominently display an image of the most prominent symbol of Yuan power and sacral authority upon his head. Quite outside of the political circumstances, we should also remember that with the decline of Buddhism in India, Tibet became the new Holy Land in the West and source of Buddhist learning. In this Chinese painting from a set related to the Shui Lu Jai, or water land rite from Baoning Si, an arhat is depicted writing in Tibetan, which had become by this time the medium of the faith. Right, so arhats were considered the original disciples of the Buddha and the preservers of his teaching after his passing into nirvana. So with the passing of Buddhism in India, the Tibetans were perceived as the preservers of those teachings now. Also, for the Tibetans, as pilgrimage and trade became less viable to the West, with India, the Chinese became increasingly important for trade, and one sees a noticeable Tibetan population shift east. Remember that more Tibetans now live in eastern Tibetan areas of common Amdo than in the Tibet Autonomous Region itself. The first official expression of Ming interest in Tibetan Buddhism came only a few years after the Ming Dynasty was founded, when in 1375, the first Ming Emperor, Taizu of the Hongwu period, sent a letter of praise to the fourth Karmapa Ronpa Dorje, who had held one of the highest positions in the former Yuan court. As previously mentioned, Tibetans provided a model of sacrosanct rulership, an esoteric means to power for the Mongol Empire, and the Yuan imperial preceptor, the highest religious authority in the land, was always Tibetan. The Hongwu emperor, formerly a monk under the previous Yuan system, would have been familiar with their role. He himself had been part of a movement to cast the overthrow of the Mongols in a Buddhist millenarian light, using such imagery as the coming of the King of Light, Ming Wang, from which the very name of the dynasty was chosen. Sources also record that he patronized several Tibetan lamas and their monastic projects, which is contrary to traditional Confucian accounts of the Hongwu emperor. Indeed, continuity can be traced in the Tibetan patriarchs who served both the late Yuan and early Ming courts. But it was Hongwu's son, Ming Chengzu, commonly known by his reign title, Yongla, who was the first Ming emperor to establish significant ties with Tibetan patriarchs, and there's been increasing acceptance that he was probably a believer in Tibetan Buddhism. The Yongla emperor was not the crown prince and had seized the throne, thus a cloud hung over his legitimacy. As part of his strategy to bolster his right to rule, he invited high lamas to come to court. As an imperial prince, he was granted the former Mongol capital in Beijing. He took up residence in the former Mongol palace, opened the former imperial libraries and treasuries, which had been preserved and sealed, and retained some of the Yuan palace eunuchs who were left there. This was likely one of the direct conduits of Mongol imperial culture, which would have included Tibetan Buddhist practices into the future Yongla court. The Yongla emperor is known in Tibetan sources, such as the Blue Annals, as Yewang, or the Prince of Yen. His previous title as the Prince of the Beijing area, right? Yanjing Pijo, Yanjing beer, that's the same yen. Suggesting that the Yongla emperor, who was not the crown prince, was well acquainted with Tibetans, and they with him, during his early career in Beijing before he seized power. The most significant event in Sino-Tibetan relations during the early Ming was the visit of the fifth Karmapa Deshin Shekpa to the early Ming capital of Nanjing in 1407. In dealing with the Karmapa, the Yongla emperor consciously drew parallels in his own actions to Kublai Khan's relationship with his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa during the founding of the previous Yuan dynasty. According to Tibetan sources, the Yongla emperor expressed an interest in recreating their priest-patron relationship. The Yongla emperor also made a similar offer to send troops into Tibet in order to install the Karmapa as the temporal ruler and forcibly convert all monasteries to his order, an offer which the Karmapa similarly declined. This offer can be seen as something of a trope, as it parallels Kublai's offer to Pagpa, as was Pagpa's declining in favor of religious plurality. No mention of this is made in Chinese sources, as the Karmapa turning down the emperor's wish to project Ming power into Tibet was not the kind of thing to be recorded in the official dynastic histories, as it did not reflect well on the emperor. So here's a reminder to be aware of your sources, their interests, and their biases. The Yongla emperor also bestowed on the Karmapa the title Dabao Fawang, or Great Precious King of the Dharma, the same title Kublai bestowed on Pagpa when the former declared himself Great Khan. The Karmapas were of special interest to the Yongla. So anyway, here's a picture of the Yongla emperor as a disciple of the fifth Karmapa. The Karmapas were of particular interest to the Yongla emperor, as they were the last preceptors of the Yuan and were viewed as anointers of sacral kingship par excellence. Indeed, after the Karmapa's visit, the Yongla emperor styled himself a Chakravartin universal ruler. And here we see this relationship codified, where the Yongla emperor is receiving consecration as a sacral ruler. And you can see actually that the emperor's face is reflected in a mirror here during ablutions, just as one would consecrate an image. Some Tibetan sources also obligingly describe the Yongla emperor as a Chakravartin king after these events, specifically an iron wheel Bala Chakravartin, one who turns the wheel of the doctrine by force. One of the most famous manifestations of the Yongla emperor's engagement with Tibetan Buddhism is a monumental 50-foot long hand scroll called the Long Hand Scroll for the Salvation of Ming Taizu, which records the miraculous occurrences during the memorial services performed by the fifth Karmapa in 1407 at Linggu Si, Nanjing's largest temple, for Emperor Taizu, Empress Ma, as well as Taizu's parents, in a series of 49 narrative paintings. Right, so this is to reinforce that these are actually his parents. On one level, this painting can be viewed as containing a political agenda, as rumors circulated of Yongla's possible Mongol or Korean ancestry after he seized the throne from his nephew, with assistance from the Mongol cavalry who submitted to him in 1402. Questioning Chengzu's ethnicity, denying his very Chinese identity, has been a means by which to isolate and marginalize the Yongla emperor's interest in Tibetan Buddhism, one still employed to this day. For example, Wen Fang, a professor of Chinese art history at Princeton University and is highly influential possessing the past, introduces the question of Tibetan influence in the early Ming by referring to the rumored Mongol or Korean ancestry of the Yongla emperor as fact. The manner in which the Yongla emperor came to power naturally put a cloud over his reign and made him concerned about the image of his own legitimacy. This hand scroll had a clear political agenda in confirming his right to rule, and it used strategies similar to those employed by the Mongol court to project power across Asia, such as multilingual inscriptions in Chinese, Persian, Tay, Tibetan, and Mongolian, right? So these inscriptions here. This recalls Mongolian strategies, such as the multilingual inscriptions in Tibetan Mongolian square script, more commonly known as Pakpa script, Chinese, Tongut, and Uyghur, lining the walls of Zhuyongguan Stupa Gate, just north of Beijing, which also spoke to imperial identity in a Buddhist framework. So for instance, here's the Pakpa Mongolian square script. As Pat Berger has discussed, the hand scroll also makes clear use of a well-established Chinese Confucian tradition of omens employed as legitimizing propaganda and were recorded to demonstrate the ruler possessed the mandate of heaven. Here we see a composition, Auspicious Cranes, also known as Cranes over Kaifeng, recording an event at the Northern Song Imperial Palace in 1112 during Song Emperor Huizong's reign. We see this relationship was also important from the Tibetan side as well. Later portraits of the fifth Karmapa directly reference the Yongla hand scroll and feature the distinctive architecture of Lingusi. So here you can see these halls are directly reproduced in portraits of the fifth Karmapa. And of course, his relationship with the Yongla emperor. Beyond such well-publicized objects as the Yongla hand scroll, which had a clear political agenda in confirming legitimacy on the Yongla reign, by contrast, is the 1413 missive scroll, which the Yongla emperor sent to the fifth Karmapa, describing the famous eunuch Admiral Zhenghe's voyage to Sri Lanka and the capturing of the Buddhist tooth relic. In it, the emperor describes his own religious visions, right, while he's meditating, which clearly went beyond the bounds of what would be required in diplomacy. Visual evidence of continuity from the Mongol Yuan in the artistic production of the Ming Imperial Atelier is the presence of an already fully mature Sino-Tibetan artistic synthesis in the early years of the 15th century. The most famous examples being the bronzes of the Yongla period, right? So this didn't just pop out of nowhere. Here we see a fusion of Nepalese sensuousness of form with the Chinese aesthetic and the jeweler's-like precision in their ornamentation. Such richness of detail and visual complexity in the ornamentation lies at the very heart of the imperial splendor conveyed by these objects. The sheer volume of Tibetan Buddhist art produced at the Yongla court can, perhaps, only be matched by the Manchu Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century. As Heather Stoddard has demonstrated, Yuan court prototypes for these Yongla Buddhist images can be found in Yuan woodblock prints and locally in the surviving stone carved images at the aforementioned Zhuyongguan Gate, which date to the final years of the Mongol Empire in China. But perhaps the most significant commission by the Yongla Emperor for the Tibetan cultural world was the massive 1410 printing of the Tibetan Canon, or Kangyur, in Tibetan, Chinese, printed in Hangzhou. While there has been earlier printings of individual text, this was the first time the Tibetan Canon was printed in its entirety, increasing its ability to be reproduced and disseminated, which of course is one of the roles of the Chakravartin. These printings were bestowed on temples and monasteries throughout the Tibetan Buddhist world. One was gifted to the head of the Sakya order in 1414, and another to the Lama Shakyeshe in 1416. Shakyeshe's biography describes it, and I quote, "A wonderful set of the Tripitaka printed for the first time in China, printed in vermilion on ink, and its covers faces written in gold letters. Such volumes were bound in luxurious red lacquer book covers, like the ones you see here, made from white sandalwood and ornamented with incised decorations of the 8 auspicious symbols inlaid in gold," right? So these are truly luxury items. This prominent recipient of the 1410 printing, Shakyeshe, was a personal attendant to Tsongkhapa, the founder of Sera Monastery and the third of the 3 main Tibetan patriarchs received by the Yongla Emperor. He received the title Dazi Fawang, or Great Compassionate King of the Dharma, from the emperor. Originally, it was actually Tsongkhapa, founder of the Gelug's order, who was invited by the Yongla Emperor. But finally, after repeated requests, Tsongkhapa sent his disciple Shakyeshe to the Ming court in his stead. Needless to say, this snub of an imperial invitation is also not recorded in Chinese sources. The use of silk in the creation of Tibetan Buddhist icons was a prominent characteristic of Mongol Yuan court production, a practice continued into the Ming. This remarkably intricate silk embroidery was given to Shakya in about 1419. And he's actually depicted here in the top right. Here I pulled out a detail of him. You can recognize his distinctive hat. This remarkably intricate silk embroidery of the meditational deity Hivadra served as both a diplomatic gift and documentation of imperial legitimacy. As first discussed by Amy Heller, according to an extensive Tibetan dedicatory inscription on the back, it was gifted to Shakya in recognition of his visit to the emperor. Building on Amy's initial work, I focus my reading of this object on the two lines here pulled out at the bottom, and the translations are in bold. Homage to one who has come into the presence of the Dhammaraja, meaning the emperor. Homage to he who gave me, king of merit, this Hivadra empowerment, right? What's depicted on the front. The choice of subject matter for this gift is quite telling, as Hivadra was an essential initiation given to the Mongol emperors as part of their sacral investiture. The Yongla emperor followed these Yuan precedents in his own initiation as a sacral ruler, receiving the Hivadra initiation from each of the three main Tibetan hierarchs who visited the court. He thus received both blessings and a kind of consensus about his legitimacy from the three major leaders of the time. Thus, the theme of this gift is as much about the authenticating the Yongla emperor's initiation into this tradition, and therefore legitimacy as a sacral ruler, as it is about the Tibetan Lama who received it, right? So, I mean, actually, Hivadra is the main meditational deity of the Sakya tradition. Shakya is, is Gelugpa. So here there's obviously a different message in mind. Taken together, one could also speak of such underlying messages related to the awe-inspiring gift of the 1410 Tripitaka as well. Right, as a deed of a universal ruler. The imperial kilns of Jingdezhen continue to produce Tibetan-inspired objects and porcelain, another Chinese luxury medium, as they had under Mongol rule. However, rather than focusing on figural forms as manufactured under the Mongols, like the one you see here on the left, the Ming created much more utilitarian vessels, like the one you see on the right. Extremely simple, elegant forms, such as this ewer shaped like a monk's cap, were also based on Yuan prototypes. This ewer features a subtle incised decoration and invocation in Tibetan. I don't know if you can very barely see it under the glaze. While discussions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism tends to be limited to the Yongla emperor, he was by no means the most extreme among Ming rulers in his adoration of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan art continued to receive significant court patronage, especially under the Xuande and Chonghua emperors. But Emperor Wuzong of the Zhengde period was an enthusiastic patron of Tibetan Buddhism who took a zeal to a level few had dared. According to his unofficial biography, the Wuzong Waiji, and I quote, "The emperor studied Tibetan scripture, converted to this religion, dressed in Tibetan monks' robes, and practiced the Dharma at court. This no doubt horrified the Confucians at court, who had to compete with the monks for their emperor's ear. Much of this is omitted from the official accounts of his reign, which simply says that he was an ineffectual ruler, and I quote, not interested in culture, and therefore little was accomplished in the arts." According to Tibetan sources, the Zhengde emperor adopted the Tibetan name Rinchen Palden, and even went so far as to style himself an emanation of the seventh Karmapa. Far from wishful thinking on the part of the Tibetans, this assertion and the mission of the eunuch envoy who was carrying these tidings, along with many gifts, was received rather coldly by the Karmapa's court. I think the Tibetans kind of thought he was a nutter. The letter of invitation in Chinese and Tibetan was preserved at Surpu Monastery and photographed by Richardson, which you can see here on the left, photos of which are now part of the Pitt Rivers Museum's archive. Chinese sources only mention that the mission was a failure, but do not mention the Karmapa's refusal to even receive the envoy. A detailed Tibetan first-hand account of this ill-fated mission is also recorded in the Kebegatan, which further relates that the Chinese were so insulted by the cold reception that they received that they took all their toys and went home, only to be sacked by bandits on their return trip. Kind of wonder how the bandits knew. Anyway, as Sperling has discussed, Golotawa's account, right, the author of the Kebe-Gatun, even includes an incredulous Tibetan Ripley's Believe It or Not style account of what a eunuch is. Right, so the very concept of a eunuch must have been alien to a culture where a sizable percentage of the male population were celibate without resorting to surgery. And so here's a nice portrait sculpture on the right of the author of the Blue Annals, and also an attendant of the 8th Karmapa and a personal witness to the mission. Richardson thus identifies the Tibetan name Rinchen Palden, such as on this tanka, as none other than the emperor himself. And Marcia Halfler has further contextualized this painting by identifying the occasion of its commission as the emperor's birthday. Other extant Tibetan Buddhist paintings, rituals, temple construction, and so on also date to several emperors' birthdays, suggesting that Tibetan Buddhism was an important part of the emperor's personal sphere. And as David Robinson has observed, these close ties between the imperial family and Tibetan Buddhism were well known by the populace in the capital, as lamas were granted special privileges, such as carriages and escorts, which would have been visible to all. A more polished, professional painting, now in the Musée Guimet, from a similar context, which subtly integrates Tibetan imagery into Chinese visual modes, is this martial figure charging on his dapple gray steed. The swirling pastel-colored auspicious clouds of pale pink, yellow, and orange that frame the composition are a common trope in Ming Buddhist painting, as observable in the Yongla hand scroll and many Ming period wall paintings. As Marcia Halfler has demonstrated, it is quite likely that this painting of Kubera was once part of a stately and imposing set of 9 paintings, flanking a very similar work in size, style, and subject matter of Vaishravana, which you see here on the right, with an identical inscription to the previous Jungda painting, only dated a few years later to 1516, now in the Nelson Atkins Museum, also painted on the occasion of the Jungda Emperor's birthday. And the difference in the appearance between these two paintings here has a lot to do with the later restoration work. This martial theme of the guardian Vaishravana and his 8 horsemen generals, known for intervening in battle since the Tang Dynasty, joined the Jungda Emperor's adoration of Tibetan Buddhism with another one of the emperor's assumed identities, the general Jusho, seemingly inspired by the iron-wheeled warrior ruler, the Yongla Emperor. Indeed, the following year, in 1517, the emperor went north, just north of the Zhuong Pass, in the guise of this general, right? He even had himself listed like in the lists and the payroll, to see action against the Mongols raiding on the frontier, which Ming forces seemed powerless to repel. And actually at one point, one of the emperors is captured. So I guess in today's terms, you'd say he was a cosplay enthusiast. The martial depiction of the armored god, his retinue of stately celestial officials, and the gleeful demonic warriors, who are really quite charming, look at this guy giving you the side eye, are all drawn from Chinese divine martial imagery. However, the deity that floats above at the top center, which hopefully, you can see up here, is clearly drawn from Tibetan models. The sword held in the warrior's right hand and the mongoose spitting jewels in the left, and his dark color identify him as Kubera, one of the 8 masters of horse and guardian generals of the southeast in the retinue of Vaishravana, a wealth god, war god, and guardian king popular in both Tibetan and Chinese pantheons. Taken together, the Jungda Emperor's interest and action suggest a wish to revive the imperial model of the martial universal ruler on the Tibetan model of his predecessor, the Yongla Emperor. Here, a suggestion of imperial identity is further revealed in the banner standard held behind Kubera up here. Here I've pulled out a detail, and you can see it has the 5-toed dragon, which is reserved only for the emperor. So as we can see, demand for Tibetan objects within the Ming court was strong, and the impetus for their creation multivariate. Aside from the emperors themselves, eunuchs were also important conduits between the creation of art at court and court-supported of Tibetan Buddhism. This was due to the intersecting layers of the eunuch bureaucracy at the Ming court. both in their roles as the controllers of the imperial construction apparatus, the Ministry of Works, and as the official imperial envoys to the Tibetan patriarchs. Thus, the eunuchs were in close contact with the Tibetan clerics at court and often became their personal patrons, and then used their positions overseeing court artists to create Tibetan Buddhist images. This sculpture is a reliquary from Hongjue Temple in Nanjing, donated by the eunuch Li Tong, using his Buddhist initiation name, Li Fushan. This same eunuch of the inner court, Li Tong, was the principal patron of a small private temple on the outskirts of Beijing, founded in 1443, Fahai Si. Li Tong served as director of all imperial artists, the director of imperial accoutrements, or Yu Yongzhen. While the basic architectural and painting programs of Fahai Si are clearly Chinese, a subtle Tibetan presence is observable in various Tibetan forms that appear throughout the temple. For example, on the ceiling in each of the 3 coffered bays over the central altar are 3 large mandala, which are linked to Tibetan mortuary liturgy, such as the central Vairochana, which is specifically related to the purification of all bad rebirths tantra, the Sarva Durgati Parishodhana Tantra. In this way, the Tibetan mandalas on the ceiling are linked functionally to the Chinese waterland ritual paintings on the walls in their role for the salvation for the dead, right? So eunuchs couldn't have children to perform ancestral rites, so they would build these temples called shengsi, living temples, which would perform these mortuary rites and annual rites on their behalf. And here you see Marichi here, actually, who's also a god of war, goddess, I should say, is wearing a Tibetan 5-leaf crown. And the squatting form of our old friend Mahakala here on the far right was once found amongst the statuary, unfortunately destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. Direct evidence of a significant presence of Fahai Si found in 10 Tibetan names on the back of the record of Fahai Si stele. The first and most famous on the list we have already met, right? Tsongkhapa student Shaki Yeshe. However, there is one problem with his presence on Fahai Si's donor stele, as he died in 1435 en route to Tibet, while construction of Fahai Si did not begin until 4 years later in 1439. And actually, this is sorry, it's a little blurry, a lovely embroidery, which also features Shaki Yeshe that's now in the Met. The third name on Fahai Si's stele, Peldon Tashi, is the most interesting in this context, for he not only appears to have played an actual role in the founding of Fahai Si, but also was abbot of Chutanza in Amdo, out in modern-day Qinghai, far away on the Sino-Tibetan border, a provincially located temple built with imperial sponsorship. Peldon Tashi was directly involved with Buddhist practice in Beijing and wielded significant influence within the National Buddhist Registry, the Sanglu Si. He served as the 5th Karmapa's translator at court in Nanjing, translated numerous Tibetan texts into Chinese, and even ordained several Ming officials, including some of those that were sent to expand Chutanza by the court. Chutanza, in Tibetan Drotsang Dorje-chang, was founded in 1392 in present-day Ludu County, 43 kilometers east of Xining in modern-day Qinghai province. So here, where this red star is located. Its location is described in one of its own early Ming dedicatory stele as being on the border connected with the Western kingdoms, right? That is Tibet. And thus, at the meeting of the northwestern Ming frontier and the eastern border of the Tibetan province of Amdo. As Sperling has discussed, Chutanzi is one of the earliest expressions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism, and an examination of Tibetan chronicles and Chinese imperial records reveal that Chutanzi was dependent on the Ming court's support and protection. In turn, its patronage was part of a larger Ming Sino-Tibetan border strategy to establish an alliance between the local authorities and the Ming imperial court. And as Gray Tuttle has observed, if one maps where Ming military garrisons end, see along here, one finds that a network of such court-sponsored Buddhist temples picks up. The early Ming court repeatedly sent eunuchs to inspect and participate in the construction of Chutanzi, marking it as an important court construction project on the Chinese Empire's periphery. Chutanzi, like Fahaisi, is Chinese in architecture with a mixed Chinese and Tibetan, with a mixed Chinese and Tibetan painting and statuary program. The outer painted gallery depicts the life of the Buddha in blue and green Chinese landscape paintings, such as you see here on the left, including this adorable elephant offering a flower. While inside the halls, the paintings appear Tibetan in both style and iconography, such as you see here on the right. However, Tibetan in style and iconography they may appear at first glance, Chinese painters' hands are nonetheless revealed in numerous small details of these Tibetan-style images, such as the skull crown of Mahakala, who you see here on the left, right, strung through the eyes, not a Tibetan technique, strung through the eye sockets, which is painted in the same manner as Ming Wang found in Chinese temples, such as at Pilusi, right? And shorts placed modestly on figures, otherwise depicted nude in a Tibetan context, which is also characteristic of Chinese production of Tibetan Buddhist imagery. So who likes short shorts, right? Here. And also on this Ming period painting in the MFA Boston, you can see it maybe more clearly. This suggests that Chinese painters of the imperial court atelier were able to adjust the style and iconography of their paintings between Tibetan within the halls, like here on the right, and Chinese, such as here in the outer gallery on the left. Chutanzi was once well appointed with large-scale gilt bronzes produced at the Ming court, as evidenced by a surviving near life-size bodhisattva with a Yongla rain mark, which you see here on the left, which is now in the Qinghai Provincial Museum. So they know this comes from Chutanzi. This was probably one of the 8 great bodhisattvas which once flanked a much larger central triad, probably 1.5 stories tall in proportion. These are recorded as created in imperial workshops and sent west, suggesting a larger pattern of other statuary. The one on the right, now in the Czerniewski Museum in Paris, both sculptures linked both by size, aside from the broken crown, they're identical in size, and a distinctive trilingual rain mark in Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan. The halls of Chutanzi became increasingly splendorous in their imperial architecture as one moves towards the rear of the complex. The rear hall, Longguodian, is said to be based on the blueprint of Fengtian Hall of Beijing's Forbidden City. So here you can see a comparison of the architecture. And I believe this is discussed in Ariel Campbell's new book, which I'm just starting to have the pleasure of reading. The description in a local Tibetan history, the Dome Chujung, implies that this rear hall was built as the Yongla Emperor's memorial hall, a statement reiterated in the imperial bilingual dedicatory stele. This rear hall contains a long life to the emperor inscription on a wooden placard, which records that it was erected in the 2nd year of Xuande, right, 1427, by eunuchs of the Directorate of Imperial Accoutrements, right? So this is the same organization as Fahaisi in Beijing. This Director of Imperial Accoutrements, Meng Ji, also the same position from that organization, was sent by the Ming court to personally supervise the construction of Longguo Hall. Such a high-ranking officer of the imperial construction apparatus was almost certainly accompanied by numerous high-ranking master craftsmen from the imperial atelier. And Longguodian's architectural workmanship has been favorably compared to other inner court productions by eunuchs, such as Fahaisi and Zhihuasi in Beijing. It would seem from various textual evidence that the main halls, as well as the covered gallery and 8 of the subsidiary halls, were all conceived of as part of the same construction project by the Yongla Emperor. And it is stated directly that the Xuande emperor was, and I quote, fulfilling the wishes of his father and thus completing his vision. Textual evidence that Chutanza was only one example of a much larger pattern of imperial patronage along the Ming Tibetan frontier. Thus, an imperial formation of Sino-Tibetan art and architecture is suggested by Fa Hai Si and Chutanza, both early Ming temples of Chinese construction, decorated with varying quantities of Tibetan imagery. While one might be tempted to dismiss the Tibetan elements that appear in otherwise Chinese architectural contexts found at temples such as Chutanza as simply resulting from their close proximity to the Sino-Tibetan border, in other words, as a marker of their regionalism or provincialism, the presence of the metropolitan temple Fa Hai Si, as well as other works discussed here today, suggests that a more complex and imperially sponsored formation of Sino-Tibetan architecture was operative. However, Tibetan Buddhism was not consistently supported during the Ming. When the Tibet-crazed Zhengde emperor died without an heir in 1521, and a cousin raised far from the capital ascended the throne, it marked an important shift in both identity of the imperial family and the orientation of the Ming court away from Kublai's model of rule. Under the succeeding Taoist Jiajing emperor, Buddhism underwent active suppression, temples were destroyed or converted, and Tibetan Buddhists were ejected from the imperial institutions. However, a second massive conversion of the Mongols to Tibetan Buddhism in the late 16th century replaced waning Ming interests, later revived by the Wanli emperor. And yeah, I think I'll stop there since probably my time is up.
All right, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Claps. Students, while we have a few minutes left with Karl, does anybody have any questions or things we could ask Karl while we've got him here?
Do you want me to stop sharing my PowerPoint, or should I keep it up for questions?
Oh, Sam has a question. Let's see if we need an image or not.
Okay.
Yeah, Sam, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. So thanks very much for that. I took some time to go through your reading the past couple of days, the reading we were assigned, and I noticed that you mentioned that some of the bronzes were mass-produced. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, is that mass production a result of sort of the fashionableness of sort of Tibetan iconography throughout the Ming Dynasty at the time, or did it serve another purpose?
Do you mean mass production in terms of the way it's produced, or just the sheer volume?
Just the sheer volume, the fact that anything was mass produced at all.
Mm-hmm. No, I think this has to do with both Yongla's personal interest in this. Mm-hmm. If you also, if you haven't read Wenxing Zhou's chapter yet, you'll also see that he also, the Qianlong Emperor, was also personally devoted, but also very much interested in Tibetan Buddhism's ability not only to help with his own rule, but also to serve the state. And I think that they are parallel and not mutually exclusive reasons for this kind of mass production. I mean, clearly they use them in the court themselves. They also sent them out as gifts. But clearly this was and the cost, the quality, and all of the gold that went into these, right? Clearly this is a very, I don't know if you call it public statement, but it's a very clear court statement, right? So you can imagine all of these things. I in order to save time, I cut out the description of I don't know if I have this in my article or if it's published maybe in the Ming, in the British Museum conference volume. But anyway, there's a dedicatory stele at Fa Hai Si for the donation of the main Buddha image by the Yongla emperor, which was probably the main image that other image flanked. So that 4.5 foot tall sculpture, right? There would have been 8 of those, and then there would have been a triad, usually 1/3 to 2/3 larger. So you've got to figure it's like a story and a story and a half tall gilt bronze image. That's for one hall out on the border, on the Sino-Tibetan border in Amdo. And there's a whole string of these temples. So you can imagine the imperial statement here about his identity as the universal ruler. And in the dedicatory stele, the Yongla emperor compares himself to the sort of great classic Chakravartin of Udayana, right, from India. So he's comparing his own commissioning of that image to that image. And not only that, but he records the story that this large sculpture was so difficult to cast that his artists couldn't do it, and they went away for lunch one day, and they came back, and it had miraculously manifested whole, right? And so this is a very specific kind of image in the Tibetan tradition, the rangjung, the self-arisen image, right? So it also gives, how shall we say, it also speaks well to Yongla's role as universal ruler, that Buddha's self-manifest for him, right, to help spread his, not only the Dharma, but his majesty, right? So I think it's both his personal devotion, but also the very prominent role that Tibetan Buddhism is, a political role, is playing at this time. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Sorry, I got it. And then just a quick thing. What is the Hivadra initiation? So
Hivadra is the main meditational deity of the Sakya tradition. And so Kublai Khan's imperial preceptor, Chogyal Pakpa, was from the Sakya tradition. And most of the succeeding imperial preceptors after him were Sakya. And so the how should we say, like the root initiation that one receives from this tradition, the kind of entryway, is the Hivadra initiation, right? So for instance, if you want to be able to perform the destructive rites of Mahakala, right, the paladin, the protector deity of the Mongol Empire that helped conquer China, first you have to be initiated into Hivadra. So in that tradition, it's like kind of the entry point. And so what you see is Yongla very carefully emulating the Mongol emperor. So all the Mongol emperors from Kublai on all received this initiation from their Tibetan imperial preceptors. So this establishes a pattern, right, as part of their sacral investiture, and that Yongla follows it. And what's so interesting, for instance, in the example of Shakyeshe, is that's not the primary meditational deity of his tradition, right, of his sect, nor is it his own primary meditational deity. So it doesn't really have as much to do with Shakyeshe as it has to do with the Yongla emperor and the message he's sending.
Right, and I like framing of like a political continuity.
Right.
Is your argument. That,
right.
Yeah.
Like I have received the same initiations and the same consecrations as a sacral ruler as all the Mongol Khans before him. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can I ask a finicky question? When the language around kusa, silk tapestry, silk tanka, what's at stake in the differences and distinctions there? Are they purposeful or accidental?
Well, part of the problem is whether you're trying to translate kusa or you're trying to give a sense of what it actually is. I don't know if you saw, but Rob Linroth wrote a review of Faith and Empire, and he criticized the way I just talk about kusa. So I guess I should tread carefully. But basically, no. It's a very specialized technique, weaving in silk, where the different colors. I mean, one direct translation is like cut silk tapestry, right? But basically, if you go to When Silk Was Gold, they have a great explanation and even illustrations of how the warp and the weft work. But basically, different color blocks have different constituent parts of the weave, so it gives a little bit of dimensionality to it. And even though this weaving technique was used I think as early as the Tang by the Chinese, it's really in Central Asia, especially among the Uyghurs and the Tanguts, that this is really developed. And so the depiction of Tibetan Buddhist images in this very specialized and very costly technique associated with the imperial courts starts with the Tanguts. Now, again, there's a debate, could the Tanguts really do this themselves, or did the Chinese have to do it for them? My understanding from Russian scholarship into Tangut sources is that, yes, the Tanguts had workshops for this, but anyway. But the main point is that this was associated with Tangut court rule, and it's really the Tanguts that set up this Tibetans as imperial preceptors, right? And the story of the repelling of Chinggis Khan's attack on the Tangut capital through the use of Mahakala, right? The defeat of the greatest conqueror in world history through ritual magic. So that really seems to have made an impression. And so the Mongols also, amongst other things, consciously adopt this practice as well. So for instance, if you look in Gendin Denpa's chapter, there's a 8.5 or 9 foot tall kusa mandala, silk tapestry mandala, now in the Metropolitan Collection. So you can really see that the Mongols really embrace this.
No, I wasn't criticizing your inconsistency. I was more curious because we actually, in our midterm, I just made them write a midterm question about the distinction of terms between Tanka and Kusa. So, and they had read we hadn't gotten to this part, but we had read the Uyghur chapter. And anyway, so yeah, I was just interested in how you made those choices. Or, I mean, of course, you're also beholden to what collectors and collections want to call their things sometimes.
That's part of it, yeah. And
we were noticing, yeah.
I mean, some of that inconsistency may also have to do just with the tombstones received from the lending institution. Or
what individual authors do in translating between languages and everything.
Yeah, right. So I tried to follow a sort of more literal translation, which is also the same language that the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco uses, and we borrowed the two kusa in our gallery was from them. We were actually originally planning to have the big one at the Met, the big Vajrabhairava mandala. That was going to actually be. I don't know if you got a chance to see Faith and Empire in the gallery.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so that was supposed to be the central wall. That was why the whole exhibition was on the 6th floor. It's the only wall in the whole museum that
fit.
That thing could fit.
And then the Met pulled it, or?
We thought. Anyway, I guess I shouldn't tell too many stories out of school, but we had sort of an unofficial understanding. But what it came down to is that. Well, at least the official explanation is that the thing was too big to fit through the door of the museum upright. So they were going to have to tilt it a little to get it through the door, and they didn't want to do that, even though I've seen it on their own carts in that position. But anyway.
Of course.
But anyway, we kept it in the book because it is it's such a great
spectacular
part of the story.
Piece. And I saw it once at the Met on display for, I don't remember which exhibit that was.
Right afterwards. I have a feeling that's the reason we didn't end up getting it.
Yeah. More likely, yes. Right?
Yeah. But anyway, we had some nice pieces. We had the Cernucci 4.5 foot tall Yongla bronze, which is probably...
this guy, right?
Yeah, which is either probably from Chutanza or one of the other from this series of temples.
What do you know about the dispersion of those objects from Chutanza? When were they...
Well, my understanding is the Cultural Revolution. A lot of these 60s. Temples were very badly trashed. In the mid 60s, and thankfully the wall painting survived, and some of the sculptures from Chutanza survive at the Qinghai Provincial Museum. But a lot of stuff was melted down. You had these these crazy things, the Great Leap Forward, and where people were encouraged to have everyone was encouraged to have their like own smelting. And so lots of things got melted down, including some of, the most sacred images in Lhasa. So I have a feeling that probably had something to do with it. There's also a bunch of stuff in the Dunhuang Research Association has at least when I visited there back in the 90s, they had a storeroom just crammed full of, I don't know if they have that stuff out on display now, but I remember noticing at least one tag casually that said Chutanza on it. So I have a feeling that things got dispersed. Yeah. But mostly destroyed.
Yeah, mostly destroyed. And that's something, we try to emphasize a lot, is we're always dealing with a really partial record, right, of what there was. Like we've got fragments, bits and bobs, but what there once was much, much more. Right.
Well, and access too. Like if we could have access to the Lhasa archive, for instance, or some of these other sort of massive archives, then, there very well be a lot more textual sources that we can bring to bear on this as well. And hopefully a significant amount survives, and it's just a matter of time. But, the way the political winds are blowing these days with this, what is it called? National unity message. Things like the different, Tibetan history or Mongol history or Uyghur history, that's all being, so I don't think that'll be anytime soon, but I'm hoping that once again, like the Leonard van der Kuip did a really wonderful book on this manual of Tibetan iconometry that was commissioned by the fifth Dalai Lama's regent Desi Sangye Gyatso, and I think that's in the archive, and that was done as a collaboration between I think the Austrian Academy. Anyway, he was involved in that, and Tibetan institutions. So if that can happen again, I'm hoping that more will come to light. But stuff's coming to light all the time.
It's true. Yeah.
It's crazy. Even in auction houses, someone passes away and whatever was in their attic comes to light, and every once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Then the last few hundred years have been tumultuous, would be an understatement. So, like there's a lot of things hidden. That's one of my regrets all the time when I research, like even Shalu, that there must be all sorts of, not all sorts, because a lot has been lost and destroyed, but like paintings that are hiding, in private collections that I may or may not see in this life.
Well, that's one of the exciting aspects of this field. I apologize if there's anyone in the audience who studies Italian Renaissance, but to me, the thought of having to say something new about Michelangelo and some of the tortured English language that comes around as a result of that, that's definitely not a problem. I'm not saying that there aren't new things to say. I'm just saying that in an area where things are so well covered and so well published, it's great to be a student. But if you're doing research, pretty much as soon as you start on a project, you're kind of opening new territory. And I think that's very exciting. It's also very difficult because the field is so young, but there's so many texts that are just coming to light and that haven't been studied, and being made available through places like BDRC, Buddhist digital resources, it's really like a kind of
treasure trove of research possibilities. So students, I hope you're listening, all 31 of you. Start studying Tibetan now if you haven't yet. We offer it here at the University of Toronto. You can even do it online next year.
Come to the dark side.
And then you can do some, we have some native Chinese speakers already in this group too. And you can do great things. There's a lot of fun research to do. And a lot of interest, a lot of fascinating history, right? I loved, Karl, your big takeaway point, I think, with this whole catalog and then also with the presentation you just gave us, is how effective art is for understanding like what you called art as an expression of soft power. And I mean, and then you also kind of illustrated that, I mean, it wasn't only soft power, it was very real power too, right? Soft power indicates these hard power things, right? Or like also, you know, gestures towards them in ways that also the texts don't always, right? That was another recurring theme, is that if you look just at Chinese sources, they don't show this part of the story because of the thing that that source is responsible for doing, right? So it's the importance and the power of seeing art as telling this like fuller story of what's going on in relationships and in history. So I find that really exciting.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of not so soft power, you know, this Mongolian helmet that I have up here has all of these wrathful deities and mantras of power, right? Yamantaka, one of the main war magic deities in the tradition. And then all of these little sigils are actually then have in Tibetan underneath them, right? Protection from swords, protection from arrows, protection from being snuck up on. I mean, you know, there's a very real application to this as well. It's not only symbolic.
Yeah.
So, and if you read my overview chapter, something I tried to highlight is that, you know, this isn't just in Tibetan sources, right? That Chinese sources also talk about the role of Mahakala in the conquest of China. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Students, is there any other short questions? We have to let Karl go though. We're over his time. Does anybody want to chat? Any questions or have we done enough for today?
Perhaps they suffered enough.
No, I know they're loving it. I thought that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy work day to do this and speak to us about your research. That's just fascinating. So thank you so much.
Not at all. It was my pleasure. And I'm so happy to see too that this is the publication is being used in the classroom, because as I said, it's the way it was designed. And I was very sad when Berkeley didn't take it, couldn't do it. So I'm thrilled. Yeah. So thank you very much, Sarah, too, for
well, you're welcome. Thank you. I mean, it's a great resource for it, right? It's the right length and the right level, right? It's very hard otherwise to have found before this. You know, we can't really read in an undergraduate classroom a full, you know, I don't know.
Dissertation.
Yeah, exactly. So we needed kind of condensed, focused. Plus, I love the organization of it, right? Like actually a sequential organization is what undergraduate students need, I think. Or you know, like if you're coming in without, I don't know. There's so many classes we've been exposed to that try to not teach history sequentially and just in theoretical terms. But I think a lot is lost there too if you don't have. You know, we can't assume everyone has the same world history background. Of course not, right?
Right. So, well, that's what the Project Himalayan Art's all about too. So hopefully that'll be a good resource for the classroom as well. And thank you for contributing into it. So.
Yeah. Well, great. I look forward to it. Yeah. Thanks. And thank you so much. We will let you go on to your many curatorial duties today.
My next meeting. Oh yeah. Thrilling.
Thank you. And good. Thank you so much though.
Oh no, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, and let's all give him a hand. Thank you very much, Karl. And they're saying, I don't know if you can see the chat, but Anandita is saying it was wonderful to have you here. Feng Yi, thank you. Bilin, thank you. Serena says, thank you, Karl. Yeah, and these are our students who, some of them I'm so impressed. Anandi says in India. We have students in Korea. Jungin is in Korea. We have people all over the world. We have a bunch of students in China who are attending in the middle of the night. So,
well, I'm impressed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Karl. Have a great rest of day.
I hope good luck with your class.
Thank you.